Заводится сердце, сердце волнуется, почтовый пакуется груз. Мой адрес не дом и не улица, мой адрес Советский Союз, мой адрес не дом и не улица.
Hello, I'm Violetta.
Hi, I'm Margot. Welcome to the podcast. So, Violetta, what exactly is this rotating statue in front of the Kremlin that we're looking at?
We are looking at the intro to every typical Soviet movie. Everyone knows it. It's a statue of a worker and kolkhoz woman. And for those who may not know, kolkhoz is the collective farming. But what is more important to understand is that it is a representation of a rural and the urban coming together, and agriculture and industrialization, the core of the Soviet economy. And what is important to understand is the symbolism behind the statue, because apart from them chanting or singing something, and apart from them being at the forefront of this revolution and this reformation of the society, and what it represents is this unity of industrial and the agriculture, and also the unity of nation and the unifying ideals. Those two people were the people that everyone should look up to. And the unity is something we are going to talk today about.
Yeah. So this podcast is mainly going to tackle this issue of collective identity in the Soviet Union, how it was created and how it was preserved. And the three main sub-branches that we're going to talk about today are how the Soviet Union was nationalist in form, but elitist in its content. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about the rituals as a Soviet substitution for a religious tradition, as well as economic equality of the system, communalties, and the report system as vehicles for mutual accountability in the society.
Okay, but what is important to understand is that we are tackling a very long period of time. We are basically talking from all the way back to the revolution to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we're doing it mainly because from the sociological point of view, the change of identity does not happen rapidly. It does not happen over one generation or two. And that is why we want to see the big picture, even though we may sacrifice some of the details on the way.
Okay, so Violetta, how exactly is this statue related to all the 16 ethnicities of the Soviet Union?
Well, first of all, 15, because the Karelia-Finn Republic exited Soviet Union in a very early stage, and so for the most of the time, it was only 15 republics. But the first identity was Soviet. I am a Soviet person, I am a Soviet citizen, came way before this self-national identification. And we have two great examples. First is the poem by a famous revolutionary poet, Mayakovsky. We can hear it right now. He's saying, "Little thing so dear to me, I withdraw from my loose pantaloons. Read it and envy me. I happen to be a citizen of the Soviet Union." The Soviet passport was the core of identity for everyone.
Right, and it also encompassed this duality of people's identification, both the national identity, because you had, whether you're Russian or Ukrainian or Kazakh, you had that, but at the same time, you had this Soviet passport.
Yes, and I think it's valid that everyone preserved their national identity, but at the same time, my home address was the Soviet Union. It wasn't the particular place or a particular city. It was the motherland.
Yeah, so let's listen to this funny, naive Soviet song.
Yes, that basically addresses this. But another thing is that despite of the presence of 15 different republics, there was a notion of some of them dominating over the others. And even now, I sometimes face a situation when people from abroad talk about Soviet times as Russian times, and Soviet governance as Russian governance, and people who fought in the World War II as Russians, neglecting the presence of all the other nations. So can you maybe tell me a little bit more on how did that happen and why?
Yeah, sure. So right after the revolution, the main emphasis of Bolsheviks was the internationalist workers' movement. They strove to abolish borders, to have the international revolution of the workers, and they sought to abolish all past culture. So, for example, this is how abstract art came about, because it didn't rely on any tradition of,
Okay.
culture.
Existing, yeah.
Right, yeah. So it created new realities. They tried to not identify with Tsarist Russia. In fact, they refused to pay reparations to the other countries for withdrawing from the war. So here we are. Class is the central issue here. As time went by, though, they realized that there was a need for this grassroots incorporation of the Soviet value system into people's lives, because there were so many remote regions that had no idea that they were actually now not Russia, but the Soviet Union.
Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. So they issued this decree for self-determination of nationalities, and everyone was welcome to embrace diversity of language and of culture. This was, interestingly, a very clever trick to make those countries trust Russia or the central governance,
How
Moscow.
so?
Well, it is because Imperial Russia used to oppress the small peoples. They were deprived of their rights. They were supposed to pay taxes. And now the Soviet Union was allowing them to speak in their national language and supporting them through different programs. So this was great for them. In exchange, they were expected to implement changes in education, to start thinking about what the Soviet culture is within this framework of national self-determination, to implement administrative structures. The caveat here is that everyone needed a common language to speak.
Definitely.
Yeah. And this language happened to be Russian because of the capital, Moscow. And this then was detrimental to the consecutive time. So as revolutionary idealism fades away, people realize that not teaching history is not the way. So they start looking for ways to teach history and nationalism, and start constructing this identity through associations with history. Unfortunately, the history that was constructed in history books after many discussions was national form, but very etitist in content, because they were relying on Russian narratives of heroes, of tsars that unified Russia, for example, Ivan the Terrible or Peter the Great, so that people would look up to them as national heroes.
So let me make sure I understand something. The new history that was taught in schools across all the republics, was it Russian history, or was it a combination of Russian history and the history of your republic?
Right. So unfortunately, Russian history was the dominating history, and all the history of other republics were only taught as supplements to this dominating narrative. And as a prominent Soviet historian, Fitzpatrick, put it, there was this shift in emphasis from workers being the vanguard class of the Soviet experiment to Russian people being the vanguard nation. And this is crucial here.
I see. When the switch was happening to Russian languages, there was also the switch of the alphabets and
The Cyrilization.
The Cyrilization, exactly. And we can see an example of how Kazakh language that used to be written in Arabic was now also written in Cyrillic, along with several other languages. Let's now see from your grandparents, Ira and Zhenya, as they are describing the reality of living along side by side with people from different nationalities.
Right. So they actually, what they were trying to convey was, hey, look, there was total equality and people were free to do what they want. So whenever you went to Arbat, your shoes could be polished by Armenian people, and everyone knew that if you wanted your shoes to be perfect, you go to Armenians, or the Georgian people would sweep the streets, and that's, some people just like to sweep the streets because that's what they want to do.
В Москве самые лучшие эти были, вот которые драили туфли, будки такие стояли и драли, это были армяне.
As I was hearing this, I was highly alarmed because what they were saying sounded like institutionalized racism.
But apart from the history and this aspect of the language, what were some other perhaps cultural aspects that also contributed to the creation of a unifying identity and the collective mindset.
Yeah, this brings us to an important point, rituals. So in 1918, officially, the Soviet Union abolished religion. They separated the state from the church, and they started a campaign of atheist propaganda. There was a severe decline in faith. The priests were imprisoned or shot.
Right. And only priests, because the republics were the combination of Christianity and Islam and some of the local tribal religions. So.
Yeah. And all of that was discarded as this backwards,
Exactly.
Unnecessary. So what we have then is this vacuum of spirituality. People do not have any moral rock to which they could hold on to. So
What came instead?
instead came this attempt at creating Soviet rituals. That wasn't very solid in the beginning, and during the Second World War, as people really needed the spiritual support, the Soviet state did make some concessions towards spirituality, and there were some churches reopened both in Moscow and in regions. But in the 1960s, we can see a rising popular demand for civic rituals. So there are new substitutes to mark a rite of passage. The soldiers that were going to the army had this ritual of army farewell. We had golden anniversaries to mark 20 years or 50 years of a marriage. We have the first day of school, the 1st of September, which I think we all know as this excessive celebration
of knowledge. Yes.
Knowledge and teachers.
And I think they've been so deeply rooted in the society that we can often see them in the movies, in the everyday settings. For us, people who grew up in the post-Soviet world, they're still very common and very known.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about some of the more important rituals, like the ritual of birth or the ritual of marriage?
Yeah, we'll see how the rituals, although it sounds like it's a different ritual, in fact, they were just reworked from the previous religion. So if we look at the wedding ritual, it retained the traditional elements such as having an authority delegate. We have the parents of the newlyweds. It was all maintained. They built new wedding palaces that would capture the drama and significance of the moment. But see, it might as well have been a church. It has the same role.
I see.
Do you want to tell us about the baptizing?
Definitely. We have an interesting primary source. It's an example of what is called civil baptizing ritual. And I will read an excerpt. Dear parents, to acknowledge the act of initiation of your son or daughter as a citizen of USSR, please approach this goblet of fire. Inside the goblet of fire is the flame that embodies the fears of the heroes that sacrificed their life for the freedom of the Soviet motherland, for the clear sky above us, for the happiness of us and our children. And another one, you have come to the festive ritual with your friends that from here on shall voluntarily become the civic guardians of your child. Margarita, tell me, what are these goblets of fire and civil guardians?
Well, this is clearly a continuation of this dominant Christian tradition that was around before the revolution, because Imperial Russia was predominantly Christian, and people were deeply dependent on those rituals for their well-being, because rituals is something that you do to connect with your community. And zooming out from this individual rituals that are significant on this family level, let's look at celebrations that were meant to unify the whole nation, the whole of Soviet Union.
Yes, because after religion was abolished, it seemed like the calendar became empty because all the religious holidays were also abolished. And so...
Like Easter, Christmas.
Exactly. And there was a need for something that everyone could relate to. And that something became this new Soviet rituals, especially the communist ones, like the celebration of the Workers' Day, the Labor's Day, or the celebration of the revolution itself. That became very important. Later came the Victory Day and the New Year's Eve that also changed a lot of traditional perception of the New Year and came as a substitute
for Christmas.
For Christmas,
Right.
Exactly. And our lovely primary sources, our grandparents, told us a lot about those celebrations and the parades that were happening. Do you want to share some of the insights?
Something that my grandparents really, really emphasized was that when they went to this Labor Day, to the 1st of May parade, it was not at all anything political. It was not a day of solidarity with workers. It wasn't anything like that. It was them carrying banners, looking at parents carrying their children on their shoulders, smelling the flowers, feeling this that like the spring has come. So there's definitely this idea of detaching the form from the meaning.
And it seems like the community idea was prevailing. So it was more about spending time with your friends, spending time
Together with people and bonding instead of following this politicized agenda.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And I think another great example of this community bonding and community celebration together was something called the mass celebration sector or mass entertainment sector that existed at every factory, every enterprise, everywhere where people were working together. They were technically obliged to come and sing in the choir or dance or recite the poetry. And it was their way of culturally educating the population, as well as, again, bringing the community together. Why do you think work was so central? Why did the government pay so much attention to the workplace?
Well, it was because everyone was supposed to be employed. Everyone had to be contributing to the society in some meaningful way. And this is symptomatic of the central planning economy. Violeta, you're more of our economic expert.
Definitely. I think something a lot of people forget is that communism is not only the ideology. To a much bigger extent, it is the economic system in which everyone is supposed to be equal, and the Soviet Union was trying to bring this equality to the people. What is important about this equality is that you keep being on the same level of life, and it brings you closer, because it would be harder for me to understand your lifestyle or your life struggles if between us there is a huge inequality gap.
Absolutely.
But this gap was technically eliminated in the Soviet times. Another interesting way in which the government was supporting the idea of communal working was something called subotniki, or cleaning on Saturdays, and also communal cleaning of the fields, because in this collective farming, there was often not enough people and not enough literally hands to work. And that is why students from high schools or from university were taken together, put into the car, and sent to the village for a weekend to help working on the fields. And it was this unifying, collective working atmosphere.
Absolutely. My grandfather told me in the interview that we conducted recently that it was a matter of prestige to go and work in the fields, because
Exactly.
if you don't care about the supporting your country's agricultural development, who are you?
И мы были в особом положении как бы перед остальными студентами, которые не поехали на Целину.
Exactly, because even though it was essentially voluntarily work, you could feel a social obligation to go.
Yeah. All right, Violeta, so coming back to this idea of economic equality, it seems like everyone was aware of each other's economic situation. How come?
One of the main ways is living together. There was something called kommunalki in
Communal living space.
communal living spaces in the Soviet Union, communal living apartments. Here we have the register of tenants and the plan of this one apartment that basically shows how one big apartment in the center of St. Petersburg was compressed, and many families were moved in. And from one family living in there, over the course of 10 years, almost 37 people were inhabiting only one apartment.
Wow.
Exactly. The way they did it is one room for one family, communal corridor, communal bathroom, communal kitchen. And it surely affected your perception of what is your and what is shared, what is private and what is public. there was a lot of tensions in between, because there are all the stories how sometimes even you would have 4 different lamp bulbs in the toilet just for the sake of knowing that it is you who is using the electricity for your light bulb in the toilet and not someone else.
That is absurd.
Especially absurd because you had to pay literally coins, very small amount of money for the electricity.
That's very petty.
I don't think it is petty. I think it is the sense of having your hand on your things and making sure to control some sort of your private life.
So it seems like although the Soviet state really wanted people to assimilate into each other and have this communal identity and almost no personal space, it naturally emerged that people wanted the personal space.
People naturally wanted the personal space because of who we are as human beings. But something that the Soviet Union and Soviet governance succeeded in is giving you an understanding that I am your friend, regardless of who I am. There was a story by my grandma given that in one of the kommunalka, the communal living spaces, there was a family of drug addicts. And despite of all the inconvenience that they were bringing in, people still cared about them and about their little kid because there was a sense of emotional connections.
And accountability.
And accountability, definitely, between the people. But apart from these happy uniting moments, there was also danger, a constant danger that you will be reported and that someone is watching you, because it was very hard to hide any of your personal business. Have your grandparents experienced any of that?
Yeah, so very interestingly, they have not. In fact, whenever I tell them about all the books that I read about KGB and deportings to gulags, of course they were aware that it was in place, but they never realized the extent to which it was present. So it seems like people lived in bubbles. If you were close to someone who might be a traitor of the motherland, you and people that surround you will be affected. If you were not, you may have lived in ignorance of the deeds of the KGB.
And I think it's definitely one of the limitations of the primary sources we were working with, because conducting an interview with our grandparents was very important and very meaningful for us to understand the feelings of the atmosphere. But of course, some of the factual knowledge could have been flawed or lost precisely because of the reasons that you have just outlined. Or maybe it was not even about being part of the bubble, but it was rather the reports had such a common everyday connotation that perhaps people got desensitized over them. An example that my grandma gave me is this wall of shame that was...
What?
Yes, there was this wall of shame in the center of my hometown where you would find people placed who are switching jobs all the time or who can't find jobs all the time, or the young girls who go dancing before they are socially acceptable to go to the dances.
Jeez.
So,
did she quit?
She did. She stopped going to the dances after that. However, there were also preventative reports, which was basically reporting to the authorities against someone else's report on the person. Very complicated system of ratting on each other.
Yes.
However, we have an example. It's a primary source. Do you want to read it out loud for us?
I will. Baya Yosifovna, who works in our department store, co-lives in our apartment for over 15 years. In the apartment, she behaves politely, modestly, and all inhabitants of the apartments have a deep sense of respect for her. We decided to write a given claim in case you will receive a denunciation from Comrade X. The latter is known from writing false denunciations in her attempts to belie and make false accusations of well-behaved people. The matter is the following. The family of X, a 60-year-old mother, a 40-year-old daughter, and 2 children, are the bane of our flat's existence. They mess with all the tenants, pick fights, and debauch around, and then compose denunciations to various organizations regarding all tenants, including the children. X even complained about the kindergartners Sveta and Tanya and their school headmasters. Our flat is primarily populated with elderly people who are also sick, so we absolutely cannot handle the situation of X. Whatever X composes is a complete and utter lie.
Which is also a great example and a proof of something that was common, this false denunciations or lying denunciations, when people would write reports on one another without it actually being true, just because they want to get this one more room in this communal apartment living once they will be arrested and moved out. Essentially, your life was in the public domain, but was it bad or good?
So I think it was both, because on the bright side, there was this system of mutual support and accountability. People felt like
They could rely on each other.
if you left for a holiday, they will babysit your child.
Exactly.
At the same time, some people, like your grandmother, for example, had to live in this constant fear of being reported on. Whatever you would say, even the smallest anecdote could be ratted out, written to the authorities, and you had the possibility of going to Gulag.
Unfortunately, yes, that's a very sad side of the Soviet Union. Great. So we have just outlined 5 big aspects of life in Soviet Union that has created a sense of communal accountability and collective mindset. Let's go through them once again, briefly.
So we talked about how the Soviet Union was nationalist in form and seemingly embracing all the states such as Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, etc. But it, in fact, was etatist, so it was emphasizing the domination of Russia through history and through language.
And Soviet Union through culture.
Yes. We looked at rituals as a substitution for a religious tradition that had been in place before.
Definitely. And rituals as individual and as well the collective ones.
Absolutely. We talked about economic equality and how central planning equalized people. We talked about the communalties, the communal living spaces, apartments, where people would support each other. And lastly, we talked about the report system that had both the supportive and caring for each other side, as well as being this shadow of surveillance at all times. Before we wrap up, I'd like to take a minute to reflect on the things that we learned during this podcast, because it was, I think, personally very important for both Violetta and myself, because we learned a lot about how our personal identities were formed. We learned a lot about our grandparents. So Violetta, what is your main learning here?
I would say 2 things. First, when creating this podcast, we had this debate or whether or not we should include our countries of origin, because our countries of origin are Ukraine and Russia for Margarita. Mm-hmm. And I, at some point, realized that it creates a huge source of bias for the way we perceive Soviet Union, and also for the way our parents perceive and grandparents perceive Soviet Union. But another thing is, I realized that Soviet Union is not all for bad. And the collective identity, even though it was artificially created to some extent, it does not mean that it was fake. And it does not mean that people should just neglect years of their life for the sake of new individualistic connotation in the society, existing in the society nowadays.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think my main takeaway here was I've always struggled with feeling guilty for being from a country that has dominated the escape of the post-Soviet region from Russia, and feeling like I have to be accountable for this superiority that my country has imposed upon all the other states, such as Ukraine and Belarus. And I think intellectually understanding how come it happened the way it happened was really helpful for me to be able to acknowledge my limitations, but also to be able to balance them out in the future.
That's beautiful. Thank you.